Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining me for the Oregon Legacy Literary Authors Series, and thank you, Driftwood Public Library, for inviting me to be here. As you probably already know, I'm Lori Tobias, author and journalist based in Newport, the place I've called home for more than 20 years. Unfortunately, I'm not a native Oregonian, but I am an enthusiastic and grateful transplant. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, where I spent the first nearly 2 decades of my life 3 doors down from the house my dad was raised in. It was a small town, one bordered by many other small towns, all walkable, all leading at some point to a bigger town and eventually a city. It wasn't a progressive place, but it came with the attributes that make life livable: public transportation, accessible libraries, a good school system, and bottle returns for cash long before most anyone else had heard of such a thing. Fresh out of high school, a mere 18 years old, I moved to Alaska, and I never really looked back. I've spent my career as a journalist working at a variety of publications, most notably a major metro daily in Colorado and another in Oregon. I've also freelanced for nearly all of my career, including for the New York Times, and I still write for a few publications, but these days you may know me as the author of Stormbeat, a journalist reports from the Oregon coast. Stormbeat is a memoir published by Oregon State University Press last fall. It's a behind-the-scenes look at the 10-plus years I covered the coast for the Oregonian. Many of the stories were dark: capsizings, drownings, falls, murders, murder-suicides, floods, landslides. Still, I loved the coast. I loved it from the day I discovered it nearly 3 decades ago, when I built that first bonfire on the beach and watched the sunset over the Pacific. I loved it then, and I love it now more than ever. But it hasn't always been an easy romance, and in truth, there were days when I wondered if my marriage would survive. My husband Chan was a power lineman, and for more than a decade we traveled, following the big construction jobs from Alaska to Pennsylvania to Connecticut to Seattle to Southern Oregon, where we discovered the coast on our weekend camping trips. From our first early visits, I said if we ever settled down, it was going to be on the coast. But staying put wasn't in our plans at the time, and so it was off to Denver. 7 years later, it was there that I happened upon the job opening at a Central Coast utility. Longing for the beauty I remembered from so many nights in tents just steps from the Pacific, I submitted his resume. And when he was offered the position, I encouraged him to take it. And then I got a dose of reality. Let me take you back to October 1st, 2000. After 3 days traveling through Wyoming, Idaho, and finally Oregon, we pulled into Newport on a Sunday morning. Chan was at the wheel, our pets, a beagle, bearded collie, and a 20-something-year-old Siamese mix in the back of our new Chevy Blazer. I was in the passenger seat, and I had just walked away from an awesome job at the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. There I was a columnist and a features writer. I loved my job. I loved the city, my colleagues, even my editors who treated me well and generally gave me free rein. But I didn't like being landlocked, and the coast still called my name. And now, here I was at a house I'd never seen save for a handful of pictures. It came with a view of the ocean, an ample backyard for the dogs, and a quick and easy walk to the beach. But it also came with a very dated kitchen, a bathroom with a door painted black that opened to a rear deck covered in mildew, and, as we were about to discover, 30-odd aluminum windows that sweated buckets of moisture, rain or shine. Welcome home. I'd come to the coast to get quiet, find peace. Here was a place I thought that represented everything a writer needed: a small town setting, the hum, or more likely roar, of the ocean, evergreens towering over the headlands, the wild calla lilies, rhododendrons, and azaleas, the lights of the fishing fleet winking in the night, the fresh seafood, the lazy winters, punctuated, of course, by crazy winds and equally crazy horizontal rain, the photo-ready sunsets, and the phenomenon of the green flash, which I admit I've yet to see. It was a small town, not unlike the one I'd grown up in, though not particularly walkable, and certainly not from one town to another. Still, here I thought was the place where I would finally see my novel through, and then work on all those other projects begging to be brought to life. Essays, short stories, a memoir, another novel. There was so much writing to be done, if only I had the time. And now I would. Eager to make the new house our home, I hurried off to Walmart for cleaning supplies. And that's when, roughly 2 hours after arriving, the idyllic world I'd fashioned in my imagination developed some cracks. Big cracks. "You're going to hate it here," the teenage blonde cashier told me. "All it does in the winter is rain. Rain, rain, rain. Trust me, you're going to hate it." "Not at all," I said, perhaps a bit too smugly, all the while wondering, oh dear, what have I done? It would be some time before I could answer that question. Meanwhile, I was pretty miserable. For all I had romanticized about the Oregon coast, I had neglected to really appreciate how lonely, how quiet, how limiting such a place could be. In Denver, I'd regularly been invited to pro sports games, restaurant openings, and galas for whatever fundraiser was happening at the moment. On the coast, I was hours from the nearest airport, hours from the nearest metro area, translated hours from shopping, and thousands of miles from my nearest friends. And while it had formerly been easy to imagine, even long for, those endless, uninterrupted hours in the chair before the blank screen, the reality, finding the discipline, the fortitude, the faith, yes, the faith, to do so, especially when the words wouldn't come, was a different matter indeed. But in time, I was freelancing again, jetting around the globe as a travel writer, and yes, pushing myself to move forward on the novel, a novel that seemed so good in theory, but was failing me on the page. But slowly, I was getting to know the real Oregon coast, which really wasn't so different than the one I'd imagined, and in ways, even better. I learned to go to the docks to buy my fish fresh, and when the fish were too big for a two-person household, split it with a stranger in line. I learned that in January, after the crowds here for the holidays have left, that there is often a little-known window of what feels like summer: blue skies, calm winds, almost balmy temperatures, and we have the place to ourselves. Also, that even when the book is a blockbuster bestseller, your wait for it at the library will rarely be all that long. And so, yes, I was adapting. And then the Oregonian came calling. Did I want to cover news for them? No, actually, I didn't. I really didn't. Not news. Yet even then, as I waffled about the opportunity, I understood for a storyteller it was one of a lifetime. And in truth, I was in no place to say no. So my adventures on the coast began, and with them, the niggling, nagging sense that there was indeed a story in this beat. Nearly every day it seemed I found myself in the midst of a tale that could have happened few other places. Yes, as I said, they were often dark, but they also spoke of a land as rough and rugged, as glorious and grand as any landscape in this country, and I felt blessed to call it mine. I also understood that it had the potential to scar me in ways that would be with me long after the story ended. 6 months into the job, I found myself, utterly terrified of heights, dangling from a line off a helo, rappelling to the ground and then back up, twirling as I all but climbed for the door to get back inside. I wrote about the first anniversary of the Tacky 2, one of the deadliest charter boat accidents on the Oregon coast, and about an ugly political skirmish that left one dead, reputations ruined, and a town long darkened by its shadows. I was leaving for my mother's 79th birthday, one the last I'd spend with her, when I learned of the death of a couple in town to celebrate their anniversary. They were washed out to sea while navigating Newport's South Jetty as 22-foot waves rushed over it. I covered tragedies hundreds of miles from home and in my own backyard, all with their own particular story. Some accidents, many unavoidable, and some utter failures of the system, like the Leah Freeman cold case, a death that saw Freeman's boyfriend, Nick McGuffin, spend nearly 10 years in prison on manslaughter charges, only for it to be revealed more than 9 years into the sentence that DNA evidence indicating the presence of an unknown person had been withheld from the jury. While such stories made the news because they were tragic and usually unexpected, they also served as cautionary tales, reminders. Don't walk beyond the signs warning not to. Don't turn your back on the ocean. Beware of floating logs, falling rocks, gusty winds. And let's not forget the mega earthquake that scientists say is not an if, but when. One story came all the way from a woman I'd met 20 years prior, clear on the other side of the country. It was a story that epitomized the hazards of the Oregon coast, particularly to those who are strangers to it, and, as was often the case, a tale that came with what I'll just call its own set of coincidences. And so I'm going to read a little bit from Storm Beat. If if you haven't seen it, and of course you've probably seen it back there. Mary Ann lived in New Jersey and was a neighbor and very close friend of my cousin. She contacted me that fall wondering if I'd written about Kelly Hawthorne. I had not. I'd never even heard of Hawthorne. I reminded Mary Ann that the Oregon coast is 360 miles long, so odds were whatever happened to this person probably hadn't been near me. Mary Ann wrote back, "Was I by chance close to Glen Eden Beach?" Close. I lived roughly 12 miles away. I assumed this person was someone Mary Ann knew, but as it turned out, she had only read about the New Jersey girl in the local newspaper. She sent me a link to the story about a young woman's desire to see the stars on the Oregon coast and how that wish 1 year earlier had nearly killed her. Hawthorne, a pretty blonde with brown eyes, a lovely smile, and the personality to match, was in Glen Eden Beach for her brother's September 2009 wedding. It was late at night, and Hawthorne realized she hadn't been on the beach yet. It was so dark, she recalled. I wanted to go to the beach because the stars were so bright. I'd never seen it like that before. That's as much as Hawthorne remembers. Her friend, Evan Alexander, told me the rest. The pair decided to take a walk down to the beach and set out on what looked like a gravel path, but was in fact just decoration. By the time Alexander realized it wasn't a path, Hawthorne was already moving beyond it. She thought it was a grassy slope, he said. There was kind of like a gasp. It happened too quickly for her to do anything. I couldn't see what happened. It was too dark. I kept calling her name, and I couldn't hear anything back. I went to the edge. That's when he saw the drop-off. I got sick to my stomach, he said. I saw her feet first. She was entirely upside down, wedged face first in the rocks. I was pretty sure she was dead. Using the light from his cell phone, Alexander made his way to the rocks below. I felt I needed to at least find her first. I called 911. She started to regain consciousness. She was trying to move, and I kept trying to get her not to move. She managed to get her legs around the rock that was up against her chest, sort of like an upside-down pretzel. She was stuck even worse than she had been. There was no getting her out. Rescuers worked for hours to move the boulder so they could safely help her. Every time I think of her disappearing over the edge, I get sick to my stomach, Alexander said. Hawthorne's mom, Ruth, calls her daughter a miracle. She broke both arms, the fingers on her right hand, her clavicle, and 7 ribs. She shattered her jaw, knocked out 4 teeth, and suffered a lacerated liver and traumatic brain injury. Doctors used the inside of her cheeks to reconstruct her mouth and a piece of bone from her chin to start a bone graft. She would also need a gum graft and a permanent cheek replacement. I finished the story awed by Hawthorne's courage and the family's gratitude to the medical team who cared for her at Legacy Emanuel Medical Center in Portland. Hawthorne still faced a great deal of surgery and therapy and was already looking at $150,000 in medical debt. Her family hoped that by getting the word out about her plight, they might warn others away from the same fate and perhaps find a way to help raise funds for her debt. The next day, Hawthorne's story ran on the Metro cover, and I treated myself that afternoon to a pedicure. As my feet soaked, I talked about my day with the salon owner, including, of course, about Hawthorne. From across the room, a woman spoke up. "You wrote this?" she said, holding up the Oregonian. "I did," I said. She crossed the room and introduced herself. She was a TV reporter visiting the Oregon coast from New Jersey, and like the rest of us, always on the hunt for a story. Thank you. I am happy to say that Hawthorne is now married, the mom of 3 little ones, including a set of twins, and is happy in her home in a beach house on the East Coast, a little less treacherous than the West, she notes. So, we've talked about the dark side of the beach, but there were bright spots too. This is, after all, the Oregon coast. People come here to have fun, experience nature, soak up the scenery, relax, and one of the places they do that at is the Oregon Coast Aquarium, one of the top destinations here. Lucky for me, I live only a handful of miles from the aquarium, and I was often called there when something new or interesting was happening. And so it was with Leah. Leah is a sea lion. At the time, they were teaching Leah to paint, an enrichment activity designed to keep marine mammals like Leah from getting bored. As her caregivers helped her put painted fin to paper, they rewarded her with little fish snacks, lots and lots of little fish snacks. Then they asked, "Did I want a Leah kiss?" Now, I've always believed as a reporter that when I was on the job for a story, part of that job was to partake in whatever was going on, which goes a long way in explaining how I, mortally terrified of heights, ended up rappelling from the aforementioned helicopter. It also explains how I ended up at a bar in Adelaide, Australia, drinking an octopus martini. But that's a story for another time. So there I was at the Oregon Coast Aquarium, standing by the sea lion habitat, not giving a kiss from Leah a second thought. Following instruction from her caregiver, Leah leaned in and gently touched her mouth to mine. All good. And then, seconds into our smooch, Leah let out a belch through her nose, the salty stench of dozens of little fishies wafting between us. So pungent, I swear, I could chew them. By then, some 10 years had passed since I'd arrived, and I had, over time, discovered the coast I had imagined all those years ago. It was my home, my territory, my beat. It had taken some time to find my place. I had come thinking I knew the Oregon coast, thinking I understood what it would take to make it my own, to make it that place the artist in me could embrace. But I didn't understand, not really. And as much as I loved the landscape, the iconic lighthouses and bridges, even the manic weather, I had to learn to make peace with the remoteness, the isolation, the necessity of entertaining myself, often in my own head. And I did. I found myself telling my friends living their city lives with black tie parties and 7-course dinners about the authenticity of the small towns bordering Highway 101, of the mellow pace of life, of the rhythms of communities that turn on fishing, storms, holidays, and off seasons. I talked of the people I met, like the woman working at the Oregon oyster farm who, upon hearing of my desire to make oyster stuffing for Thanksgiving, scribbled her phone number on a scrap of paper with an invite to call for her mom's recipe. And I did finish that novel, news I received 1 year after losing my job to yet another round of layoffs. Wander went on to win the Nancy Pearl Literary Award of 2017. I followed it with the book that would become Stormbeat, a book that wormed its way into my head back in the early days of the beat and refused to leave. I knew it belonged with the Oregon State University Press, but the publication process was an intense one of queries, submissions, and peer reviews. Finally, in October 2019, we signed the contract, not knowing, of course, it would be only scant months before the world was devastated by COVID. I worried the pandemic would kill the deal, but OSU never missed a beat. In the coming months, we settled on the title and jacket art, and soon it was time to talk about the launch. I'd been through it before with Wander, and as much as I can say at the time, I was beyond thrilled. I was also a mess. A hot mess, as my niece so kindly put it after my reading in New York City. That was supposed to be every writer's dream, right? New York. And it was, except for one not so small issue, stage fright. And I have it bad. As a journalist, I can talk to anyone, politicians, celebrities, murderers, but put me up on stage in front of people, and the moment I open my mouth, my knees are rattling, my voice trembly, and my palms as sweaty as, well, those 33 windows we once replaced. Through events here in Newport, in Hershey, Denver, Anchorage, and yes, a jazz club in Greenwich Village, I fumbled along. People said, "Lori, have a glass of wine." I didn't dare tell them. I'd already had 2. Now, 3 years later, here we were again, but this time we were in the midst of COVID, and readings in crowded rooms were out. But virtual events, largely via Zoom, were in. And in that, I found my silver lining. Seated in one of my dining chairs, my laptop balanced precariously on a stool before me, behind me an arrangement of flowers, a vintage typewriter on the antique chest that was my mother's, I faced my audience. I talked and read and answered questions with nary a drop of sweat. I had found my happy place, just like the Oregon coast. I sometimes wonder what my life might have been like if I hadn't settled here on the edge of the Pacific, if I'd stayed in Denver or continued traveling as my husband and I had for 15 years. But I never ponder the question long before I come back to the answer that has always been there. The Oregon coast was my destiny, unavoidable, undeniable, unforgettable. A romance story with all the twists and turns of a bestseller. And all these years later, I still think how lucky I am to be living it. Thank you.